I want to start by giving you some sort of general information about how one thinks about images in a way that maybe we don't normally. And then start thinking a little bit about how one moves from that sort of image of an image, to what became photography, and then moved again to this idea of digital imaging. And then talk about what we have to do to generate images for digital imaging. And along the way, I want to talk a little bit about some of the software that people have used, and in particular, a really remarkable development over the past few, maybe 15 years, about allowing image processing to occur on almost a cell phone or on simple personal computers. So that's where we're going. Let's start by thinking about what are the components that one thinks about when one thinks about an image. This is just something I grabbed. And it's basically an image of a leaf with a scale picture at the same time. And so what do you think about when we think about this image? How would we define it? Well, we could define it by its length and its width. But that doesn't help very much if we want to talk about what's in the picture, right? We need to talk in some way about what the components of the picture are. Well, we can, in our kind of simple modification, we can say it's a leaf. Yeah, but how do we know it's a leaf? We know it's a leaf because we're interpreting what's actually displayed in that array, which is a picture. In this case, we also know that it's an array. And it's an array of a certain number of little dots that go horizontally and also go vertically. And in fact, what we could do is define for this an area in which we can identify a single location. It doesn't need to be as dots. It could actually imagine this thing being continuous, and it just simply would be in some way, so many inches for this direction and a certain number of inches that direction. Or since we have a scale, we could talk about it in metric terms. These are centimeter lines. So we could talk about the image that way. And then we could say, well, at position 10 centimeters across and 5 centimeters down, maybe we would say we have something that shows up as being green. Well, that's one way to think about how to define an image. But supposing I wanted to send that image to someone else. If I just sent them that little bit of information, it wouldn't help unless they had the full corresponding image to compare it with. I mean, if I just told them I had something at 10 centimeters, at 5 centimeters, and it's a spot, well, there you are. It's not clear what that implies for you. So you need to have more information than just what you might call an XY coordinate. You have to have the array of XY coordinates. You have to have the whole array. But if I were doing that, and I were doing it, say, on a telephone or some simple way of saying, I'm going to give you a scan of this image in some way. So if I were to do a scan across this image, I could say, okay, it's dark, it's got a background here, and then it goes up a little bit, and then it goes across, and it gets brighter, and then it goes down again, and then I can go across. And as I suggested with both confocal microscopy and with scanning EM, I could do a lot of these scans. and build it up, and it might end up being an image. But how would I send it to people? If I were to send it as a continuous change in voltage, then I'd have to tell them where it starts, where it ends. And I'd have to give them some idea of what these voltages represent. And then they'd have to pick it up. Well, it turns out doing that kind of continuous image transmission is not easy. We'll go through a little bit about how people have addressed that. But then there's another bit of the component here that needs to be addressed, and that is how bright or how dark is it? So comparing, say, this part of the image with this part of the image and this section of the image over here and the background, right? Each one of these has a different sort of intensity, and I need to have a way of representing that as well. So in a sense, what I have is I have the three-dimensional representation. So it's got to be length and width, but something in addition that I'd have to call intensity, if you will. Okay. And so the question then is how can one send this or transfer this kind of information, or for that matter, analyze? Supposing I wanted to analyze this set of data, how would I go about doing that? The answer comes to be, instead of looking at continuous information, we should breaking it up into smaller pieces. And that's the basic idea that we now live in the world of what are small pieces that make up an image, that is to say, digital imaging. And so let me say a little bit more about how this emerged. So it came out, if you go back and look at how people tried to transmit images, there were some very elaborate machines built that more or less said, look, supposing I have a kind of a pen on a stick, and this is converted somehow to electrical signals, and my recipient has a similar pen. Here's a pen, again, also connected in some way to electrical signals. And every time I move this pen, it moves this other pen at the recipient end. And so you might imagine that what it could do is follow and sort of trace the drawing that you did. And that works fine, sort of, for outlines. And you may see in some very, sort of older videos or older movies of people trying to transfer images in that sort of way. But if they really wanted to transfer a whole picture with all of that contrast and detail, that became a little trickier to do. And people were trying to do this as early as electronic communication developed, or electrical communication. Once people had cables running under the ocean, for instance, and tried to figure out ways of how do you transfer information. One of the examples that I thought was particularly interesting was this thing developed in 1926 called the Bartland System. And the detail of it is really remarkable. So what they wanted to do was capture the entire image and also its grayscale, that is how bright and how dark it was, and transmit all that information in a way that could sort of easily be transferred to other people. And what they did was, and if you read this thing, it's rather complicated, but the basic idea was they took the picture that they had. So here's their picture, which had something interesting in it. And they took a set of 5 pictures of it. 5. But each one was taken with different levels of exposure, so that if this thing had something light in the background and this was dark, then this image would end up being sort of black in the middle. But the next image would be a little lighter, and then you'd have something in the middle, maybe that was less intense. And the next one would have even less of that. And finally, you'd get something where you'd have nothing at all. And then the idea would be, if I took this set of images and I stacked them one on top of another, I'd be able to generate something that showed this background was all the same in all 5, but there's a gradual change in something in the middle. And so it doesn't go all the way to black, right? If I had something that was fully black, it would be black in every frame. So this has some sort of intermediate intensity. Well, so how did they then treat it? Well, they took these 5 pieces, these 5 images. They were made on zinc, and they were printed in such a way that there was a coating that was proportional to the intensity. And they put these things on a rotating cylinder. So the different pictures are now on a rotating cylinder. And on each one, they have a kind of a sensor. Or actually what they did was they had a light sensor, a photomultiplier, that read the intensity that was coming off of each of these pictures. And as it came around, okay, it made each one of these then created a dot. And so here, for instance, in this image, you have something where they all had the same intensity. There's a dot, a small dot in the middle here, which I'll draw a sort of circle over here. That small dot is for alignment, and you'll see how that plays out in another minute. Then there would be other bits of it, like here, that had only some signal. So these are the areas that had weaker signal than the one in the top. Now, what they then did was, as you rotate this cylinder, you basically use this to create the set of dots by punching holes in paper. This paper was, at the time, a standard way of sending telegraph information. So telegraph information was delivered on these paper tapes. In the same way, it was coded with letters all the way along. And now, instead of being coded with letters, it was coded with this series of dots. So this used the technology that was available at the time. And it was possible to take this tape using these coordinating dots and actually figure out where in each of these images the signal came from, and then superimpose them to actually generate a picture. And this worked. There are images that came from this system that were really transmitted and were perfectly reasonable. Although you can tell it's certainly cumbersome and it takes a long time to make it work. But this was all described in a web page on the history of fax machines, which is why it's a kind of an interesting thing to think about, because the fax machine evolved eventually into the sort of thing that people were using to send crude images back and forth. Another approach to this was developed by an interesting man by the name of Russell Kirsch. And Russell Kirsch, who died just last year, worked for the National Bureau of Standards and was one of the first to use this computer, SEAC, was actually built in 1950 and became available to him in 57 or so. And he became very interested in whether it was possible to actually transmit images and convert images into a form that could be stored in a computer. And so he spent a lot of time working on this. And what he did also is he brought in a picture of his son. He was at the time 27 years old. He brought in a picture of his son, and again, put this picture on a cylinder because that was the way it was easier to do. And again, he had some sort of sensor like a photomultiplier and rotated the picture. But in addition, because he wanted to send discrete bits of information, he put a mask on this picture to break it up into small bits. So he put something on here so that each one of these bits of information could be treated independently. Okay? Turns out this is what we now call pixels. And apparently he is considered, among others, to be the father of the pixel. And the thing for which he's unfortunately known is for generating pixels that are square. Now, you may think about this, or if you're going to break up an image into little pieces, what is the best way of separating out small pieces? And in a lot of ways, square pixels make a lot of sense. But you'll see in a minute that if you don't use enough of them, the image ends up looking very blocky. So this picture here is the first image that he transmitted. He transmitted it of his son. His son had obviously pretty young. And this famous image is the first transmitted digital image that was sent up in with a computer system. This was done not that long ago. This is 1957. So, 60 years, something like that. So it's been quite a change to go from this picture to the one we have now down here of him, right? It's a remarkable advance that has gone on through this time. The next step in thinking about digitizing and digital imaging was this extraordinary development by a man named Wayne Rasband, and let me write his name out here so we know of it. And although he's been busy for a long time doing this stuff, he's again started his work in 1987 at NIH. He had been a programmer using COBOL and some of the other languages and got into a position at NIH early on as they were developing computer systems. He had done imaging on these sort of larger computer systems, the ones that fill a room, not quite as big as the one that Kirsch used, but still pretty large computers. And he was very interested, just as these machines were now emerging, the small personal computers. He started out working on Apple computers, on the Mac computer, and developed a program while he was at NIH. So it was referred to as NIH Image. And as he was doing that, and it turned out to be pretty useful, he made it as a general open source program that anybody that had a Mac could obtain. It was written in such a way that it was easy to operate once you get the hang of it. But at the time, it was available only for this Macintosh computer, for the early Macs. And Windows computers didn't have a program like this until a company called Scion Image. Scion Image, which started out as a company making computer boards, that is computer units, plug-in boards that could be used for capturing images, doing essentially what Kirsch's system had done, which was in some way to capture the elements of an image and store them for computer use. These boards were necessary at the time because the memory in both Macintosh computers and Windows computers was so limited that they couldn't handle the images themselves. And so Scion developed these image capture boards that could store the images themselves. And they saw a need for also trying to develop an image processing program. And they developed this thing which then called Scion Image for Windows. And it was basically a copy of the capabilities of NIH Image. And this created some real problems. Among other things, the Scion Image program was kind of buggy, and it didn't work as well as people would have liked. Windows at the time were a less popular machine. But then there was this complete changeover as people went from using Macs to using Windows computers. And so this created a problem of the possibility of two parallel sets of image processing programs. And this disturbed Wayne quite a bit. What happened then was that Java was then written as a programming language designed to be run on any system. So if you could run Java if you could write a program in Java, you could write it use it on a Mac, you could also use it on a PC. And so what happened was that by combining of NIH Image and Scion into a Java program, it became possible to create a sort of a universal which is now referred to as ImageJ. Partly because it was constructed at NIH, partly because of Wayne's general feelings about this thing. This program is, and always has been, completely open source. And not only does that mean anybody can use it without paying a licensing fee, but not only that, the program itself is available for modification by anybody who uses it. And so there's a very elaborate network of ImageJ users who both submit programs, submit revisions, submit advice to an enormous list now of users of ImageJ. And this list not only is a source for modification of the program, it becomes an educational tool. So as people start to learn to use ImageJ, they submit requests, people get back answers that say, this is the simple way to do that kind of operation. So it has the advantage of being available basically to anyone across the world with a reasonable computer. And so it's taken over the field of image processing at that level. Now, beyond that now, Other companies have come in to do much more sophisticated and high-speed work for certain specific applications. But for an enormous number of people, ImageJ is still the resource that's available. So I thought what I would do is show you a little bit more about how this whole process works. And I won't use ImageJ as an example, but I will use a lot of the things that are available on the Microscopy website, because those are turning out to be pretty clear and pretty easy to understand. So let's start with this idea of what you're trying to do with digital imaging. And the answer, the obvious thing, is you're taking an image which is described as analog, which means that it's more or less continuous signal, and converted to what then becomes a set of pixels, in which the pixels represent regions of the original material. So the idea is that, say, this pixel, which is a box of uniform in density, okay, is kind of an average of this region of the picture. Now, what does one do? How does one deal with that? Well, we can put that box in a location, an XY coordinate, as I mentioned, that corresponds to where it came from in the original object. But then what we also want to be able to do is to say, what's the density or the intensity of that particular pixel? And so if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, and I go 4 boxes in here, I come to a number. And in this scheme, the darker an image is, the smaller the number. So you just see a number here, where when it's really bright, you get much bigger numbers. Okay? So that there's a quantitative aspect to this whole process. So I want to spend a minute looking at how one actually thinks about that and what the constraints are. So the first issue, as you do this sort of analysis of how we're going to break this thing up into pixels. Here's an example of an image that has a lot of detail, which as a pixelated image has very little. The idea here is that you can take an image in this program now and change the number of pixels that you use. So let's try something. Well, we'll try a similar image to the one I just showed you in the picture. And the idea is that as you increase, you notice this thing is sort of funny. It starts at a small number and it goes to fewer and fewer and fewer pixels across. Okay, so you start where this is 175 pixels to cover this whole image. But then as you cut it down, you see it starts to be fewer, and you see you start to lose increasing amounts of data. And at some point you say, oh gee, I can't tell what this thing is, right? Maybe we'll take one more example just to see what it looks like. So if I take, again, this is a radiolarian. This is an alga with a shell on it. And again, you can see that as we reduce the number of pixels, you can still make out the idea that this thing is round and that it may be hollowish, but you certainly can't see any of the detail interior. Okay, so what this is doing is showing you that the number of pixels affects the clarity of the image. But there's another way to think about this as well. Let's take a single scan through the image, okay? And you'll see, for instance, here we have an image where the analog signal is very detailed. So you can see it here. And then the digital signal, because what they've done is they're sampling only at some large interval, we're losing a certain amount of the detail. Notice, for instance, we have an area right here with a big dip in it. Okay? And if we sample coarsely, we lose, depending on which way we do it, we either capture or lose that dip. See? If we make it even more coarse, we really don't see it at all. And not even the one down here. But if we increase the number of pixels or the interval at which we select the data, we start to get a better and better representation of the original thing. And so this is something that, as one is doing image processing, you actually have to think about how much detail does one want to capture in an image? Because supposing some of this image is actually due to noise in the image, that is, you had some sort of vibrations or you had other components that interfere with the image, maybe you want to remove those and just go ahead with something a little coarser that, you know, maybe ignores the worst of it, the stuff that you think is just random noise. And then you have the same sort of issue with intensity. What kind of interval do you use for image? And here, let me draw you a kind of a suggestion of what I'm talking about, okay? Here's the idea. Let's say that this is a scale that goes from, I don't know, bright to dark, dark here to bright here. And here we would talk about, let's just say, some sort of signal. And in a perfect world, as you go from dark to light, you'd end up with a continuous line. So something that's dark will give you a very little signal, something that's bright will give you a large signal. But once again, there's a question of how much electronically you can capture, how you can digitize this information. And so what you do is you make a decision about, let's sort of take this thing in steps. How many steps will I take to go up this scale? So what I've done is I give myself 1, 2, 3, 4, which means that I end up with signals that represent sort of 4 ranges of intensity. But maybe that's not enough. Maybe what I really need to do is cut this thing so that I see really fine differences, like this. So instead of doing just 4 pieces, I'll do 32 or 64 bits going all the way up. So this is what this example will show me. If I started off just by saying either I'm on or off, you see, I can get a black or white image of this thing. And you realize there's some detail in there that I'm not seeing. So maybe I could say, well, let's divide it up a little more. So maybe I'll have now 4 gray levels. And I'm beginning to sort of see some detail, but I'm missing quite a bit. For instance, I'm not seeing anything that's going on within these structures. Okay. And now we'll raise it up 1 more bit from 4 gray levels to 8 gray levels. Now I'm starting to see some of the internal structure, and it's beginning to look a little bit like the original object, except look at what the background is doing. Here's the background, which is still, you know, it's blurred, but there's some structure to it. And here, because the differences between the different parts of this are not so great, I'm still having trouble seeing that. So then I can increase again the level until I finally end up seeing this. So these are the things that one has to work with as you do a digital imaging experiment, because you have to decide exactly how much data you need to have for the analysis that you're doing. Okay, one more component of this has to do with color. If I have a grayscale image, I can go from dark to bright on some sort of scale and translate it back into gray versus into black and white on an image. Now, if I have something in color, then we have to think of it in a different way, because what I have to do is for every spot on the picture, there's actually something that's green, something that's yellow, something that's blue, or red, green, and blue. So, for instance, this section has reddish material around the edges of the cell, but the same thing has something interior in the cells in a green signal, and what you see with a blue signal is just the nucleus. And so when one assembles this array of pictures, if you now go back to think of how I would represent that picture, I could do it by saying, let's have 3 separate scales, right? One for red, one for green, one for blue. Or I could think of it in terms of how I would structure an array in which what I would do is list for every pixel a set of 3 values. So here's, and it would be, you know, red, green, blue here, red, green, blue here, red, green, blue here. So that you could have a single image that would have all of that color information built into it. Okay. Yeah, I want to show you 2 other aspects of this. So there's a process by which not only do you take the pixels that you have, but you modify them by what their neighbors are. What? Why do that? Okay. This is a process referred to as convolution. But here's the idea. Supposing you have something in which you have a couple of samples that are either close to another or one is brighter than the other, and you can't distinguish them yourself too easily. But if they're separable by pixels, so instead of being a single pixel, this is multiple pixels here. Okay. Now, you can say, okay, let's take an array of pixels around the one that I'm looking at and modify this value as a function of what's nearby. Okay. And this is called a kernel mask. And let me show it to you perhaps in a slightly better way through the model that they have here. I'm going to take this pixel and modify it by some algorithm, some pattern that I'm going to put in, whatever it may be. And I'm going to choose it because a lot of people have already designed many of these kernels. Okay. Let's for the moment take a sharpening kernel as an example. And here's the idea. I have an array here that's 17, 97, 53, 30, 15, 4, 60, okay? That shows up in this image, assuming that they got it in the right place. The 17 is dark, the 97 is light, the 50 is gray. You see the way this works? Now, if I now take this kernel and I gradually go through this process, let's see, if I manually take this, here's the kernel, it says multiply the value of the 17 here by 0, multiply this 97 by -1, multiply this one by 0. Notice this is a value that was sort of grayish, and now it's going to be changing its value. You multiply each of these, and then you replace the center. Let's go through the next step. We add all these up, and then we replace the center with the result of this operation, which was an addition of all these different pixels. So it went from 55, which was a little on the gray side, to something 75 that's now a little brighter. And now we do it again. We move over, and we take this thing that was 30, and we go through the same process. And because all of the values around here end up being low because we're using a -1 multiplier, this value now becomes a -2. So that what happens is that what was dark, what was sort of grayish, now has next to it a much darker pixel. Okay, so that what that's going to do is emphasize this edge, if you will. We keep doing this. It's a little hard to imagine it for the entire system, but you see that this is now converting what was a 29 to a -27, which means, again, very dark. Okay, and if I want, I can run this thing all by itself in a hurry. And you'll see that what it ends up doing is emphasizing some kind of edge area within this small frame. Well, let me show you then what happens if we actually apply this kind of process to a real image. Now, you can choose a kernel that's larger than the 3x3 that they had down in the first example. And depending on what I put into that kernel, it will have different effects. So what this is tending to do is, as I move away from the pixel that I look at, it counts each of these a little bit less, and it tends to blur them, okay? Now let me try a different array. This is something called, we can do embossing, which is sort of fun. Basically what it's doing is saying, convert all the pixels around it to 0, except there's an asymmetry in making one of them -1 and one of them +1, so that what you do is you emphasize and create almost an asymmetry in the image. And this can be made even more elaborate by simply emphasizing these differences. And to give you a sense, this is the sort of thing I thought it would be worth showing as a way of sort of wrapping up what one can do with digital image processing. That this set that comes out of the ImageJ manual that shows that if you take an original sample of what's basically a bunch of blobs, you can run a series of these different operations. Okay, so here you can blur it. Here you can emphasize the edges. Here you can actually draw lines around the edge. Okay. And so for each of these, and here you just simply modify the contrast compared to the original. So that by using these different kinds of convolutions of processing of the pixels with respect to each other, so you let the image tell itself what it needs to be done, you can generate quite a bit of deeper knowledge of the original image. So I think I can stop here. Did I blow everyone away? If I did, my apologies.